Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The voicemail came in at 6:27 on a Wednesday evening, right when I was halfway through reheating some leftover lasagna and trying to convince myself that wine on a weekday wasn't a cry for help. The message was short, almost casual, and it landed with the soft brutality only a mother's voice can deliver. "We're waiting for that transfer, honey," she said, as if she were reminding me to pick up milk or drop off dry cleaning. Like it was just another part of my routine, this unspoken agreement that my bank account was theirs to manage, and my silence was a standing approval. I stood there, fork in hand, staring at the glowing screen, not even blinking. I listened to her voice again. Just once. Then again. And a third time, just to hear the smug familiarity in her tone, that subtle undertone of entitlement she didn't even bother to hide anymore. It wasn't a request. It never was. It was a statement, a gentle prod wrapped in the sweet rot of guilt and obligation. I hadn't sent anything this month. Not because I forgot, and not because I couldn't. I just didn't. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel a pang of guilt over it. What I felt was something colder, heavier, something that settled in my chest like a stone dropped into a frozen lake. And just like that, I knew something had snapped, clean, precise, final. I sat down on the edge of the kitchen counter, the lasagna long forgotten, and replayed the last 15 years in my mind like a slow, painful montage. The years blurred together, paying off Kevin's DUI fines, covering Mom's car repairs, paying for that new deck she insisted she needed, wiring money after she claimed the air conditioner broke again, always right before summer. And then the big one, covering Kevin's second stint in rehab after the first one didn't stick. He'd always been the golden child, even when he was passed out on a couch stinking of vodka and broken promises. I remembered the way Mom used to sigh whenever I brought up my own bills. "You make good money, Rachel," she'd say with that soft, condescending tone. "You're doing so well, honey." As if my success wasn't mine to own, but theirs to use. As if being stable and responsible gave them the right to drain me dry. The truth was, I'd been carrying them for so long I didn't even remember what it felt like to walk on my own. I scrolled through my messages and saw the thread of previous transfers, Zelle, Venmo, wires, all of it. Thousands over the years. Tens of thousands, probably. I'd stopped counting after year 5. At some point, I told myself it was just what family did. But it wasn't family anymore. It was a transaction, a one-way street paved with manipulation and resentment. The worst part? I didn't even hate them. Not really. I just couldn't feel anything toward them anymore except exhaustion. A kind of soul-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep could fix. I used to think maybe if I gave enough, they'd change. That Mom would be grateful, that Kevin would get his shit together. But people don't change because you pay their bills. They just start expecting more. I opened the voicemail one last time. "We're waiting for that transfer, honey." I didn't even hesitate this time. I hit record and replied in a voice so calm it scared even me. "There won't be any more transfers." I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't explain. I just said it plainly, like I was reading the weather forecast. And then I did something I'd never done before. I scrolled through my contacts, found both their names, and deleted them. Just like that. Mom. Kevin. Gone. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't a fuck you move. It was something quieter. Something colder. A decision, not an outburst. Because what they didn't know, and what I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet, was that I wasn't just cutting them off. I was planning something. Something bigger than silence. Something sharper than distance. And when it landed, they wouldn't even see it coming. It's strange how quickly you can start questioning your own memories when you finally stop playing the role everyone else assigned you. After I sent that last voicemail, 7 simple words that somehow shook the foundation of my entire identity, I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt like I'd unplugged something that had been running in the background of my life for far too long. It was like the silence that follows a refrigerator shutting off. You never realized how loud it was until it's gone. That night, I sat on my couch with a glass of red wine and a half-eaten piece of toast because I couldn't bring myself to cook a real meal. I wasn't sad, and I wasn't angry either. I was somewhere in between, suspended in this weird emotional limbo where everything felt both distant and raw. I thought back to the beginning, not the beginning of the money, but the beginning of the shift, the moment my life stopped being mine and started revolving around theirs. Dad died in his sleep on a Monday morning, 15 years ago, while my mom was making coffee and Kevin was still passed out from whatever party he'd crawled home from the night before. It wasn't some tragic accident or dramatic illness. His heart just gave up, quiet and cruel, leaving a hole in the house that never really closed. He was 62. I remember the call vividly, Mom's voice flat and hollow, just 4 words, "Your father's gone, Rachel." I had just gotten promoted 2 weeks earlier. I just started feeling like my life was finally mine. That was the moment everything shifted. Grief turned into dependence, and dependence mutated into expectation. Mom said she needed help getting things in order, so I came home. I handled the funeral arrangements, took care of the legal paperwork, and wrote the first of many checks just to keep the wheels turning. At first, I thought it was temporary. Just until she got back on her feet. Just until Kevin could find a job. Just until things stabilized. But just until became just one more thing, and then it became routine, and eventually it became obligation. Kevin was always a mess, even before Dad died. He'd been suspended from college twice, wrecked 2 cars, and seemed to collect failed job interviews like they were baseball cards. But he had charm, that lazy, boyish charm that made people want to excuse him. Especially Mom. He was her baby, her poor misunderstood boy. I was the capable one, the reliable one, the one who always landed on her feet. So I became the glue, the safety net, the wallet. I paid off the mortgage after Mom started falling behind on payments. She said it was only fair because she raised me. When Kevin got his second DUI, I paid the lawyer fees and covered the fine. When he went to rehab for the first time, I footed the bill, even though insurance didn't cover most of it. The second time, I didn't even argue. I just wired the money. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was family. But deep down, I knew I was just trying to buy peace. And the guilt, God, the guilt was a living, breathing thing. It crept into my bones, into every decision, every paycheck, every little moment of self-care that I talked myself out of because someone else needed it more. I skipped vacations. I put off buying a new car. I ignored my own needs because theirs were louder, more pressing, more desperate. And every time I tried to draw a line, Mom would say something soft and cutting like, "I just don't know what we'd do without you, sweetheart." It was never a demand. It was worse. It was emotional debt, constantly accumulating interest. You know what I mean, don't you? Have you ever felt like no matter how much you give your family, they'll never see you as anything but a wallet? A lifeline they didn't earn but still feel entitled to? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who's been there. I know I'm not the only one who's ever felt like love got twisted into obligation, and kindness got used like a damn credit card. I don't know why I did it that night. Maybe I was chasing closure, or maybe just clarity, but I went into the back closet and pulled out an old storage box labeled Dad's Papers. I hadn't touched it in years, not since the funeral. It was full of dust and brittle edges, and it smelled faintly like mildew and old cologne. I started sorting through it slowly: tax forms, insurance documents, a few handwritten notes in his spidery cursive. Nothing remarkable, nothing important. Until I found an envelope. Thick paper, sealed, slightly yellowed. My name was written on the front. Not Mom's. Not Kevin's. Mine. My pulse spiked just holding it. The handwriting was undeniably his, neat, purposeful, the way he used to write grocery lists. I opened it carefully, half expecting it to be some sentimental letter or a forgotten birthday card. But what I found wasn't sentimental at all. It was financial. It was detailed. It was something that shouldn't have been hidden. Inside was a document outlining a trust fund, a structured financial plan Dad had put together before he died. The terms were clear: Equal disbursement to both children, managed responsibly by a designated family attorney until Kevin turned 35. It wasn't just a vague promise. It was legal, binding, and incredibly specific. And yet, I had never seen a single cent. I sat there, staring at the papers, my brain trying to catch up with my heartbeat. If this trust fund was real, and it was meant to be shared equally, then what the hell happened to it? Why did I know nothing about it? Why had Mom always told me Dad left us barely enough to bury him? Something wasn't adding up. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about guilt or dependence anymore. This was about betrayal. And I was only beginning to see how deep it went. There's something about betrayal that doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in, slow and sharp, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation you didn't even know was rotting. After I found that trust fund document tucked away in my father's old paperwork, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake that night with my heart thudding like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest, my mind spinning through every conversation I'd ever had with my mother, every time she'd looked me in the eye and told me there was nothing left after Dad passed. I kept hearing her voice, the way she'd say it with this casual detachment, like it was just another sad fact of life. No inheritance, no savings, just a stack of unpaid bills and a broken-down house. But now I knew that was a lie. A calculated, deliberate lie. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even bothered to rise, my head buzzing like it was full of static. I brewed a pot of coffee that tasted like ash and rage, pulled out my laptop, and started digging. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I figured if there had been a trust, there had to be some paper trail, tax records, investment statements, disbursement forms, something that would prove where the money went. I started combing through old emails, downloaded every year's tax transcript I could access, and buried myself in a spreadsheet that quickly became a graveyard for every dollar I never saw. By the time noon rolled around, my living room was covered in papers, bank statements, envelopes with faded ink, and post-it notes stuck to every surface like a crime scene board in a detective show. And piece by piece, the puzzle started forming an ugly, infuriating picture. My father's final tax return showed an account transfer labeled Trust Dissolution Disbursement, a figure just north of $200,000. It had been cleared out within 6 months of his death. $200,000. That's not chump change. That's not a rounding error. That's life-changing money. That's the difference between struggling and breathing, between scraping by and building something. But here's the part that made my stomach turn. None of it ever came to me. Not one red cent. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a conversation about it. Just silence, like it never existed. Which meant someone made damn sure I didn't know it existed at all. I stared at the paperwork until my eyes burned, then picked up my phone with a shaking hand and called the only person who might still have answers, Mr. Caldwell, my father's old attorney. He'd retired a few years back, but I managed to track him down through a dusty listing on an outdated legal directory. He answered after 4 rings, his voice slow and gravelly, like age had worn down the edges, but hadn't dulled the substance. I introduced myself, and for a second, he was quiet. Then he said, "I always wondered why you never reached out." That sentence alone made me want to punch something. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. He pulled out his old files, said he kept the originals out of principle even after he handed off his practice. And what he told me made my blood go cold. Yes, the trust had been split. Yes, the funds had been released prematurely. And yes, my mother and Kevin were the ones who authorized it, bypassing my share by declaring me financially independent and thus uninterested in disbursement. Caldwell said he'd pushed back, told Judy that wasn't the intention, but she waved him off, claimed I didn't want the money, that I was too proud to accept it. And just like that, they rewrote the narrative in a way that suited them. She manipulated the system. She lied on official forms. She stole from her own daughter and handed half of it to her screw-up son, while I was out there busting my ass to keep them afloat. I sat in my car outside my apartment for nearly an hour after that call ended, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I wasn't even sure what I felt: rage, betrayal, grief, maybe all 3. Maybe something worse. Something hollow and deep and so old it made me question every warm memory I'd ever had of her. I felt stupid. I felt used. But most of all, I felt electrified, like something inside me had finally woken up and started sharpening its teeth. This wasn't about the money anymore. This wasn't about financial support or family guilt or any of the old bullshit I used to tell myself to keep the peace. This was war. This was deception so thick it could choke, and for the first time in my life, I had clarity. My mother didn't just lean on me, she fed off me. She chose Kevin over me. She took what my father meant for both of us and handed it over to a man who couldn't keep a job for more than 3 weeks without crashing it into a bar stool. I knew I had to do something. But I also knew I couldn't act out of rage. Not yet. I needed to get ahead of them. I needed information. I needed history. And there was one person who knew the family secrets better than anyone else. One person my mother never spoke about unless she was drunk or angry. Aunt Linda. She'd been my father's sister, estranged from the family after some long-forgotten fight that no one ever fully explained. I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager, but I remembered her sharp tongue, her fierce eyes, the way she always seemed to see right through people. If anyone knew what really happened behind the scenes, it was her. So I picked up the phone and dialed her number, unsure if she'd even answer, unsure what I'd say. But when she picked up on the third ring, her voice was calm and clear, like she'd been expecting this call for years. And just like that, the next piece of the puzzle started to fall into place. I met Aunt Linda at a little roadside diner, the kind that smells like old coffee and bacon grease no matter what time of day it is, the kind of place where time slows down and people speak in lowered voices when secrets are being spilled. She walked in wearing a leather jacket that looked older than me, hair tied back tight, eyes sharp as ever, the same look she had when I was a teenager, and she caught Kevin trying to sneak beer out of her fridge. No small talk, no awkward hugs, no forced pleasantries, just a nod and a heavy sigh, like she already knew what I was going to say before I even opened my mouth. And I was right to come to her. She didn't hesitate, didn't blink, didn't try to sugarcoat a damn thing. She laid it out like a surgical autopsy, clean, precise, undeniable. Yes, the trust was real. Yes, my father intended it to be split evenly between Kevin and me. And yes, my mother manipulated the lawyer, forged documentation, pressured signatures, and claimed I had renounced my share voluntarily, citing my financial stability as a justification to take full control of the distribution. Aunt Linda had tried to fight it back then, tried to confront Judy about it, but Judy had threatened to cut her off from the family entirely. And when Linda pushed harder, my mother doubled down, telling everyone that Aunt Linda was mentally unstable and obsessed with drama. She was painted as the black sheep, the bitter sister, the outsider. Just like that, Judy rewrote the truth, and the rest of the family swallowed it whole. Linda said Kevin got a chunk of money so fast he didn't even try to hide it. He bought a boat. A boat. My brother, who couldn't manage his own laundry, decided to blow his inheritance on a goddamn fishing boat, which he parked in his friend's driveway and let rot because he couldn't afford to maintain it. My mother, on the other hand, took cruise after cruise, telling her friends it was a gift from Frank, like it was some romantic gesture from beyond the grave instead of stolen money meant to give her children a future. I sat there in that cracked vinyl booth, listening to all of it, nodding slowly while my stomach churned. I wasn't even shocked anymore. I'd moved past that stage. What I felt now was something colder, something steadier, something sharper. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to confront them in some loud, dramatic scene that ended with slammed doors and guilt-ridden tears. I didn't want revenge that screamed. I wanted revenge that whispered. I wanted it to creep in through the cracks like smoke, quiet and deadly. I wanted them to never see it coming until they were already choking on it. So I smiled. That's all I did. Just smiled and thanked Linda and left her with a hug that actually meant something. And then I started planning. First came the gifts. Small, innocent, forgettable, just enough to stir the water, not enough to draw attention. I sent my mother a bottle of expensive wine with a handwritten note saying I'd been thinking of her lately. I booked a fancy dinner reservation at a steakhouse downtown and sent Kevin a prepaid gift card to cover it. Then came a gas card, a little box of luxury skincare samples, a new pair of golf gloves. Nothing extravagant, just enough to plant the seed. And it worked like magic. Within days, the tone shifted. My mother started calling again, not with guilt, but with sugar-sweet enthusiasm, talking about how nice it was to reconnect, how proud she was of me, how some people just know how to take care of family. Kevin started texting more, trying to play the concerned brother, asking how work was going, pretending to give a damn about my life in the most half-assed way imaginable. But I knew what they really wanted. They thought the faucet had been turned back on. They thought I was sliding back into my old role, willingly, quietly, stupidly. What they didn't realize was that every little kindness I sent their way was bait. I was setting the table, making the meal look good, letting them think they were about to feast. And once they were seated comfortably, once they were leaning in with greedy smiles and empty plates, I was going to flip the damn table over and burn the whole kitchen down. The final piece came in the form of a fake opportunity, a little side project I invented using a burner email, and a fake LLC I registered under an old business name that no longer existed. I made it look polished, sleek, promising. An early-stage investment opportunity in a boutique tech venture, targeted to friends and family first before going public. I crafted a pitch deck, a glossy PDF with just enough business jargon to sound legitimate, but vague enough to seem exclusive and risky in the right way. I even created a fake LinkedIn profile for the founder, complete with staged headshots and meaningless endorsements. I forwarded it to Kevin first, knowing exactly how his brain works, dollar signs and delusions. He called me that same night, pretending to be casual, pretending he wasn't desperate. "Hey, just saw that investment thing you sent over. Looks interesting," he said, voice dripping with forced confidence. I could practically hear the saliva dripping from his anticipation. I told him I wasn't sure he'd qualify, told him it was mostly reserved for high-net-worth individuals and strategic family partners. His ego took the bait like a starving dog. By the end of the week, he was begging me to let him in, offering up a small commitment to get his foot in the door. $30,000. The same amount I paid years ago to cover his second stint in rehab. Isn't that poetic? And that was just the beginning. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from watching a plan unfold exactly as you designed it, not in some chaotic, fiery explosion, but in a slow, methodical burn that leaves nothing behind except the sound of your own breath and the distant echo of collapsing illusions. I had been playing my part so perfectly that even I started to forget, for just a moment, how deep this game really went. Kevin wired the money without hesitation, and I knew he would, because people like him never believe the fire will touch them. $30,000. That was the number he settled on after a few days of fake negotiation, trying to impress me with his business acumen, as if I didn't remember the man couldn't balance a checkbook without help from Google. He even bragged about how he pulled the funds from a line of credit, calling it a strategic move, thinking he was finally becoming the kind of man our father would have respected. That part almost made me laugh. The money hit the fake account I'd set up through the shell company, registered cleanly under the name of a nonprofit with just enough polish to avoid scrutiny. I'd already arranged the final step ahead of time, immediate donation, redirected straight to a women's shelter I'd quietly supported for years. Not a cent stayed in my hands, not a single dollar spent on revenge in the traditional sense. This wasn't about profit. It was about message. It was about making the transaction permanent, irreversible, untouchable. I wanted him to feel the emptiness, not because I took something from him, but because I made sure he could never take from me again. At the same time, my mother was busy writing her own little fairy tale. With Kevin now convinced the money was flowing again, she doubled down on her narrative, told her friends I was finally coming around, said I'd promised to help with her transition into a more comfortable life. She signed a lease for a luxury condo on the edge of the city, put down a deposit with a check she never intended to fund herself, and then called me like she was giving me good news. "You'll love it, Rachel," she said with her syrupy voice. "It even has a balcony with a skyline view. Finally somewhere I can breathe. I let her talk, let her soak in the fantasy she'd built on the back of my exhaustion, and then, without a hint of ceremony, I called the landlord. I told him the check wouldn't clear. I told him to tear it up. I told him that whatever agreement he thought he had, it was dead. And I did it with the same calm, measured tone she used all those years when she told me there was nothing left, like it was just another cold fact of life. Except this time, it was her life unraveling. Slowly at first, then faster, like fabric fraying from a single pulled thread. The calls started the next day. Kevin's voice was the first, panicked, sharp, increasingly erratic as he realized the investment was a ghost, a hollow shell, and the money had vanished without a trace. He left message after message, alternating between confusion and rage, trying to piece together how he'd been duped. My mother followed close behind, her messages laced with disbelief and desperation, her tone slipping from pleasant to pleading to venomous, all in the span of 3 voicemails. "Rachel, this is unacceptable," she said in one. "We are your family," she said in another. "How could you do this to us?" And finally, the one that made me pause, not because it hurt, but because it was so transparent in its manipulation it felt almost pathetic. "Sweetheart, please," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "You're tearing us apart." But I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer explanations or apologies or justifications. I simply blocked them, both of them clean, final, efficient. Silence followed, thick and strange at first, like the sudden quiet after a long storm. No more notifications. No more guilt-drenched messages. No more fake concern or masked expectations. Just peace. Just the sound of my own life breathing again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, constantly pulled back by the weight of their need. I wasn't their bank account anymore, their savior, their emotional punching bag. I was just me, Rachel. Not the responsible daughter, not the dependable sister, not the crutch they leaned on while mocking the strength of the woman who carried them. And yet, even in silence, the past has a way of whispering through the cracks. A week passed, then another, and then one night, just after midnight, my phone lit up with a single voicemail from an unknown number. The kind of number you recognize immediately as something familiar wearing a mask. I hesitated before pressing play, already knowing who it was. "Rachel," my mother's voice came through the speaker, low and brittle, the fake sweetness finally stripped away. "How could you do this to your own family?" No anger. No rage. Just confusion. Genuine confusion. As if she still didn't understand what she'd done to deserve this. And I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, not saying a word, not deleting it, not saving it. Just staring at the wall as the final thread snapped. There's something unsettling about walking through a cemetery alone on a gray morning when the sky feels too low and the wind carries that hollow kind of silence that presses into your ribs. I hadn't been to my father's grave in almost 10 years, not because I didn't care, not because I forgot him, but because standing there felt like admitting that I had let his legacy be dragged through the mud without ever fighting back. But now, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt like I had something to say that wasn't dipped in guilt or shame or the dull ache of disappointment. I brought no flowers, no tokens, nothing symbolic or ceremonial. Just myself, the truth, and the weight of everything I had done and everything I hadn't said until now. The headstone hadn't changed, though the years had taken their toll on the edges. His name, etched in black granite, stared back at me with that same quiet dignity he carried in life, Frank Annealy, a man who kept his emotions locked behind calloused hands and heavy silences, but who I now realized had tried, in his own flawed way, to leave something good behind. Something fair. Something meaningful. And they took it from him. They took it from me. They turned his final act of responsibility into a selfish windfall they had no right to touch. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence stretch between us like a final conversation. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just spoke softly, as if he might still be listening from somewhere beyond the reach of everything ugly and cruel this world had taught me. I told him the truth, not the sanitized version I used to tell myself to get through the days, but the real, bitter truth. That they didn't break me. They just trained me to stop giving a damn. And maybe that was worse. Maybe that was the part that would never really go away. I told him about the shelter, how I'd sent the last of the money there, how it was going to fund legal aid for abused women, help people climb out of holes they didn't dig themselves. Maybe that was my way of tipping the balance, of trying to realign something that had gone so crooked in our family. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it never could be, but it felt like something that mattered. Something he would have respected. And if I couldn't undo the damage they'd done, maybe I could at least make sure the fallout landed somewhere that needed light. But even good decisions have shadows. The guilt didn't come crashing in all at once. It crept in slowly, sneaking in through the corners of my resolve, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Was this justice, or was it vengeance dressed in justification? Did I really make things right, or did I just even the score in a different language? I replayed everything in my head, every step, every lie I let them believe, every gift I dangled like a carrot before pulling the rug out from under their feet. And for a moment, a sliver of something uncomfortable curled up inside me, not regret, not quite, but a recognition that I had become a reflection of the same cold strategy one had once hated. I wasn't sure what that made me now. Strong? Free? Vindictive? Maybe a little of all three. Or maybe I had just finally learned what it meant to stop expecting morality to feel clean. Weeks passed in quiet relief. The silence stayed. The blocked numbers stayed blocked. The world didn't end, and I didn't unravel. I got up every morning, brewed coffee without dread in my throat, walked to work without that invisible weight on my back. I felt, for the first time, like I was actually living my life instead of managing theirs. But closure isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just a new kind of quiet. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, an email appeared in my inbox. No sender, no subject, just a link to a video file. I almost deleted it, assuming it was junk, but something in my gut told me to click. The screen opened to grainy footage, shot on a phone that shook with every movement, and I knew the moment the image came into focus. It was Kevin. He was thinner, older somehow, more hollow in the eyes than I had ever seen him. He stood on a street corner, layered in mismatched clothing, hair overgrown, a backpack slung over one shoulder like a ghost of some lost version of himself. He wasn't talking. He wasn't begging. He wasn't holding a sign or looking into the camera. He was just standing there, swaying slightly, staring at nothing. It was only 30 seconds of footage, but it felt like an hour. The kind of silence that wraps around your bones and doesn't let go. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe one of his friends. Maybe Mom. Maybe no one at all. But it didn't matter. I closed the video, sat back in my chair, and let the weight of it press against my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel remorse either. I just felt still. There won't be any more transfers. But maybe, just maybe, there's still a price to pay.